If you spent some time using TouchDesigner to create visuals, you probably have a collection of at least a few projects with different looks. But they might be totally separate projects, and trying to combine them in a live performance could get messy. The solution is what I call a performance rig. Performance rigs typically do a few different things. First, they'll have a few different sources of content where each one of those has some controls and produces some kind of an output, usually like a video via an out top. Then they'll have a way to switch between those sources and maybe even mix between them. Then have some parameters for all the different parts, including the content and the mixing bit, and control that via MIDI or OSC or something like that. And finally, they'll typically have a UI that shows different stuff that's useful to look at while you're performing. And that could be, showing which clip is active or, showing incoming audio levels or whatever, as well as controls and, previews of output and that sort of thing. Performance rigs are essentially filling the role of something like Resolume, but built in TouchDesigner rather than depending on external software. There are a few different projects that do this kind of thing that are available, and one of my favorites that's currently out and is being actively maintained is AAVJ. It's designed to look kind of similar to Resolume, where you have a grid of clips and layers and, effects and that kind of thing. It has a ton of features and it's very flexible, and I highly recommend checking that out. I'll include a link for that in the description. But you can also toss one together yourself without having to get to that level of complexity. And that's what this video is going to cover. Making one yourself can also be a good exercise in how to build out more structured kinds of projects. And it will be useful if you want to customize your setup or do things that are kind of unusual or involve like DMX lighting or, robot arms or whatever that don't really fit into an existing tool like AAVJ. This video is going to be more of a general overview of the approach rather than a step-by-step guide with every single detail. If you're interested in that kind of fully detailed out tutorial where, go through every single step building out that whole type of system, let me know in the comments, and if there are enough people are interested in that, I can do another video that gets into a lot more detail than this one. Before we get into building out this system, I'm just going to note that the toolbar up here in the top of the window is from an add-on to TouchDesigner called FunctionStore Tools. It's available on Patreon. It adds all kinds of shortcuts and helpers and things that just make it generally easier to work with projects in TouchDesigner. So I highly recommend checking those out. But just in case you're wondering why it looks different from what you might be seeing on your screen, it's because that's there. That said, let's get into the project. The most important part are going to be your sources of content. I typically call these scenes. I may do another video that gets deeper into this idea of content versus systems, but for purposes of this video, let's just say that content is a component that has some parameters and produces an output. You can often take an existing project and just go up a level, copy the project comp and paste that in, and that would basically be the content of that project as a component within another project. When you do that, you might need to go in and fix a few things. Things don't necessarily always work, pasting from one project to another exactly, but generally speaking, it should be okay. Another great approach for this kind of thing is to use external tox files, which I covered in a recent video. Tox files are really well suited to collections of content components where you have just a folder with a bunch of different files and each one is a scene, and you can kind of like move those around more easily. So that's typically how I approach this kind of thing. Another important part about content sources is that they are interchangeable. Often that means that you need to make sure that their output resolution is the same. So if I have a few components here that I've loaded in either from tox files or from other projects or whatever, currently this one's set to do 1920 by 1080, but what if the other scenes weren't set up with that the last time I worked with them. So it's important to standardize those things. And one of the best ways to do that is with parameters on the component level. One of the things included in FunctionStore tools is this button here that you can drag parameters onto, and it will make a version of that parameter on the parent component and tie it in. So if we take this resolution here, drag it on, and just drop it there, if we go up a level, now we've got a parameter there, and we change it here, it's going to change it on that top inside the scene. So I've gone ahead and done this for a few different ones. So we have 3 different components, and each one does something different, but they're all producing a single out top that's always going to be of the same resolution. But when we have 3 different scenes, we need to make sure that they are actually using the same setting. This is a good place to apply that concept of single source of truth, which I covered in a recent video. Essentially, the idea is to have one central place that's kind of the master source of that setting, and then kind of reference that out from all the different places that need it. One way we could approach this is to just add a parameter on project 1. So we're actually just going to drag that resolution parameter up here. And now that we're up inside project 1, if we do that, so we now have a single parameter here that, if you change it to something, and then we need to connect up all the other scenes. So you can select both of these and drag this on and just do bind. And now all the scenes are going to use the same setting. So if we change it here, they're all going to do that same thing. The next part is to have a way to select from the different sources or scenes that you have set up in the project. You can think of this like changing clips in Resolute. The simplest version of this would be a switch top with those content sources connected into it. So we can create a switch and then connect up all 3 of those scenes. And then we can use this index here to switch between them. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to standardize the resolutions, that this isn't changing every time you switch which one you're using. A better approach might be to have a drop-down menu that shows all the scenes in the project. And we could identify those with either naming, although that can get a little tricky if you're accidentally including things that aren't supposed to show up in that list. So if you want to be certain about it, you can select all of these and go to the tag editor in the parameters, and we can call it scene and add tag. So now on each of these, if you middle click, it's going to say tag scene. So all 3 of those. And then we can create an op find dat. And for the filters, we can go to tags and call it scene. Now that's going to show those specific scenes and nothing else. As is usually good practice, I'm going to stick a null at the end of that, call this scene table. And this could be a place where if you're looking for operators that begin with the word scene or something, you could accidentally catch this, which is why tags are usually a better approach. For reasons that are going to become apparent in the next section, I'm going to do this in a subcomponent instead of, putting a parameter on project 1 itself. So I'm going to create a base comp. And you can call this scene selector. And this would be another place where, if you're just looking for comps with scene at the beginning of the name, then it might accidentally catch this, which should not be good. Then to set up the parameter, we can click on that comp and do customize component, and then make sure that menu is selected. And we can call this parameter scene and then add that. And then we can use this menu source and a little bit of Python to link that automatically to that. We would do tdu dot table menu, and then op, and then path to that null that. And there we go. Now, anytime that we add another component and it has that tag on it, then it's automatically going to show up in this parameter. And now we can select from scenes with a drop-down menu. In order to get this actually accessing that top output from whatever is selected in the menu, we can go in here and can use a select top. And for the parameter here, we would use an expression where we would access the value of that parameter. So parent.par.scene. But this is just going to give us the name scene1. And so that's not a top, and it's not actually even visible from where this operator is. So instead of using the name, we can go up a level, and on this op find, we can add a column for path, and we can remove the type because we're not using that. Then on this scene selector, we go back to customize. In this expression for the menu source, we can tell it which columns that you should use for the value that gets shown in the UI, and then the one that's like actually there under the hood. So the one under the hood is called names. So we would do name call equals, and in this case, we'd want that to be path. We'll call equals and then named. So now what you see in the UI here is just the name, but the actual value of it is the full path to that comp. With that set up, we can go back into the component, and now it's giving us an actual path to the component, but this is still just a path to that component and not to that top output. So to get that, we would take this, which is just producing this text of the path to that operator, and we'll strip that out, and we do OP like that, and then put in that scene there. So this is going to give us, it's still going to show in the UI, it's still going to show just the path, but it is actually getting and reference to that component. And then to get what comes out of that, we would do .op, and here you would need to know the name of that out top. So as long as all of your scenes are using the same naming, you could do, out1. So in this case, you would need to make sure that all the scenes have the same name for their out top. So now we're actually getting an image from that. So we can just add an out top. And now we have a component where we can switch between these. And it shows us a menu. And if we added a new scene, then it's automatically going to show up there and work. Another important part of a system like this, especially as you add more scenes to it, is to make sure that only the parts that are actually needed are doing their work. Right now, because we have this switch that is pulling from one of those inputs, and we have a viewer that's actually causing scene 3 to cook, but if we turn that off, so now this is selecting index 0, so only this first input is being used. And you can see that with this animated wire here. If you switch that to a different one, then, this one's going to be going. So now this whole component, as long as there's no viewer that's showing what comes out of it, is basically just going to sit there idle. If you switch on this blend between inputs feature, then depending on what the value is, it might activate 2 of them just so that it can blend between them. But then if you go down to a whole number, then it's only going to use that one. Our scene selector, though, basically does this for us. So we turn the viewer off on the switch just to make sure it's not. We turn the viewer on here, or if you added like a null top and we're showing that UI, then it's causing whatever scene we have selected. So right now we're showing scene 3. So if you middle click on that, you can see that it's actually work is going on inside this component. But for scene 2, nothing's going on. It's just sitting there idle. That brings us to the next part, which is mixing between the different scenes. And we got a little bit of a version of that with this blend between inputs, but this is very limited, and I really do not recommend using this as a way to mix between scenes of content. And that's because if you wanted to mix between, scene 1 and scene 3, you would first have to crossfade between, to scene 2 and then over to that. There'd be no way to go just directly from 1 to 3. There are 2 different approaches that I tend to use for this. One is to have two of these scene selectors. So this is where it's useful for this to be in a subcomponent. So we can just copy and paste. And if we want to be, really good about it, we can go on the second one and drag this into the clone. So now if we want to make any changes in this one, it will update that. If you're interested in cloning, I covered that in a recent video. So now we have two different selectors and they can be pointing at different scenes. And then we can crossfade between these two. And to do that, we can use a switch top with that blend between inputs. You can also use a crosstalk, but I don't know whether that optimizes things where like it'll only cook whichever one's actually being used if the crossfade is all the way over to the side. So I'm just going to use a switch and turn on blend between inputs. So now we can go between those and we can select whichever two scenes that we want. So in a live setting, you would typically, have one scene playing and queue up the next thing that you want, and then fade over to that. And then, you can select a different thing for this one and so on. The other approach is to have a level setting for each of the scenes, an opacity or something, and then composite them all together. There are a lot of advantages to doing that, and you can combine more than two scenes at a time, but you need to be careful with that approach to make sure that you aren't always doing all of the work of all the scenes all the time. So you might have a level top after each, or you might even put it inside the components and have like a standardized level parameter on each, and use this opacity to blank it out. But you'll notice that even when this is all the way down at 0, this is still doing work and the scene is still doing work. So even though we're not seeing it, it's still doing all the work. So rather than using a level, what I'll typically do in cases like that is have a constant top, and this will use the same resolution that all the scenes are using. So here it's linking to that parameter on project 1, and then stick a null up after that and call it blank. And then instead of the level top, you would do a switch and have it switch between blank and the output of the scene. So each scene would have a switch with blank and its output. So then when the index is all the way down at 0 and you're showing blank, then it's going to know that it doesn't need to do the work of that scene. At this point, we have a lot of different things to control, even just for the mixer part. If you're doing the 2 decks approach, the kind of DJ style approach, then you at least have a crossfade, and you might even have, brightness on each of the inputs or something like that. Now, it is possible to do that in a live performance, just like in the network editor with a mouse and a keyboard. I've done that before, but it not a great way to do things live. A much better approach is to have a MIDI controller, or you can have, a custom built UI or something with sliders on it that you can, if you're going to be using a mouse, then at least, make sure that you don't have to like hunt around in a network during a performance. But MIDI controller is generally preferable. One of the nice things that's included in FunctionStore tools is a built-in MIDI mapping feature. So I have a controller here, and we go to the MIDI device mapper and, click check MIDI, create new mapping, and then select it from the list and test it out to make sure we're getting data, and then close that out. So now we can take this parameter, this crossfade, and typically I would, put this as a parameter on project 1 or somewhere else and not just like directly on the switch top. But for this video, I'm just going to do it there. You can go into this toolbar and click this icon here, and it will pop up MidiMapper. This component is also available on OLIB. So if you want to just load in that one rather than like installing the whole FunctionStore toolbar, you can do that too. Once you have that up, you can drag any parameter in there, and then it will listen for changes on your controller. So if you change something like that, then it will automatically set up that connection. But in this case, it tried to guess what the range of values that would be useful are, but 10 is kind of not good. So we just want to be going from 0 to 1. So now we've got our crossfade. So you can just control that. And this is a lot easier to deal with than using a mouse on a slider in the middle of the show. Then you could do that for different parameters. So like if each scene had its own parameters, you could set up some MIDI mappings for those and so on. The other way to do this is to build out a UI for yourself. And often I'll end up doing both of these things. So having, both a MIDI controller and some kind of UI. UIs are a big topic, which I'm going to cover in probably several other videos. But at a high level, for something like this, what you want is a way to select scenes, either, even if it's just like one switching thing, like having some way in the UI to show a drop down or buttons or something that you can select between. Or if you have this DJ setup, then you would want to have like 2 of those, one on each side or something, and crossfade or things like scene parameters where, there might be a bunch of them, or they might be like, each scene might have like very different parameters or something. The parameter comp is often a good kind of cheap way to put a bunch of sliders and buttons and fields and stuff into a UI without having to like individually add widgets for each. But I'll often end up using some of those to kind of like take over those more complicated areas with lots of parameters where like you don't necessarily need a custom specially designed layout for it. You just kind of need to see what the values are and maybe be able to edit them. And then you'll typically want, a preview of the output, and you might even want like 2 different previews for the 2 different sources that you have selected so that know what you're switching over to, which would be kind of like in a DJ setup, the like monitor headphones line out. The last part is to take the video that's coming out of your mixer setup and actually do something with it. You would put a null, because always use nulls, give that a name like final video or something like that, final image, whatever. So what you do from here depends on what kind of setup you're using. If you just want to show it on a projector, you would create a window comp, drag that onto the operator parameter, and you can press this open separate window, and it'll pop open a window somewhere. The monitor parameter here will switch between which window it's displaying on. And it is possible to get yourself into a case where like you've blocked the network editor, so you can just hit escape to close it out. So figure out whichever monitor you want that to be going to in here, and then you can like close the dialog, figure it out, and then open it. So make sure it goes to the right place. You usually switch off borders to make it like fill the full screen, and then you should be good to go. Or if instead of going directly to a projector or something, you could go through some other piece of software. So you could like do a siphon spout out or an NDI out or something like that. And then, if you want to like take it into Resolume to do something else with it, you can do that. With those parts in place, you have a basic performance rig. There's obviously a ton of stuff that you could add to it. You could add audio reactivity or external video sources coming in from, over a network, or, an option to record video files of the output, or a whole bunch of other stuff that you could do with this. But really the kind of core stuff is, content or scene components, a way to switch between them, often a way to mix between 2 of them or something, crossfade, whatever. And then some kind of way to control it, which would often be like MIDI mappings and maybe also EUI, and then some sort of output like a window comp. Hopefully this was helpful. If you want a more thorough step-by-step tutorial to kind of like build out a full fleshed out system, let me know in the comments. If there's enough interest in that, then I could do a kind of longer video that goes through all that stuff. If you like this video and you want to support me making more of them, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get exclusive downloads, early tutorial access, and a bunch of RayTK stuff. And even if you don't feel like paying, you can subscribe for free just as a way to get announcements of, RayTK releases and that kind of thing. Anyways, thanks for watching, and make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification setting.